So originally the title was New Agents in the MPN Therapeutic Landscape, but since all of the studies that were selected are dealing with MF, and to keep it focused, we chose to just focus on MF. Maybe we can have the next slide. So we've discussed some of these trials already this afternoon, and my job was to just briefly cover these, the summaries of some of these ongoing randomized phase 3 clinical trials in MF, and just see what your recollection or your suggestion is for endpoints. Are these valid endpoints? Are these maybe daring endpoints, or endpoints that don't matter so much, including the momentum trial for momelotinib, the BOREAS trial for navtemadlin, IMpactMF for imetelstat, MANIFEST-2 for pelabresib, TRANSFORM-1 for navitoclax, LIMBER 313 for parsaclisib, and Independence study for the luspatercept. Maybe we can start with the first one. The next slide, please. This is the momentum trial. So as you are aware, this is a 2-to-1 randomized trial comparing momelotinib once daily with placebo versus danazol plus placebo. And the drug targets of momelotinib are JAK1, JAK2, and the activin receptor, which may be important for the effects on stabilization of the hemoglobin value. So this trial is fully accrued. It was eligible for or included patients with diagnosis of myelofibrosis, previously treated patients with a JAK-I, and these patients had to be anemic and symptomatic. And the primary endpoint here was the TSS response rate at week 24. We just discussed some minutes ago with Tiziano that week 24 may be very early for many studies. And so here is the response rate at week 24. So we can discuss whether this is a good idea to test this, but maybe we can go to the results, because they've recently been published in the Lancet. Next slide, please. And this is summarizing the main data. So there was a highly significant improvement of the total symptom score in 25% of momelotinib treated patients versus 9% of the danazol treated patients. And in addition, there was a clinically significant improvement in MF associated symptoms and favorable safety, and a clinically meaningful transfusion independence rate, I think. And this was a non-inferiority endpoint. And here you can also see the most frequent grade 3 or higher hematologic and non-hematologic AEs. And I think it's important to note that anemia was present in 100% of patients at the beginning, and then after these 24 weeks, 61% were anemic in the momelotinib arm, but 75% in the danazol. So yeah, if you want to share your thoughts on this trial.
Yes, I would like to say something. I think you said, the primary endpoint. I think total symptom response after 24 weeks is okay. And I think what is so interesting is that both FDA and EMA for the first time accepted symptom response as a primary endpoint. And I think this is the first trial I'm aware of that total symptom response was accepted by the authorities. And I think this is a paradigm change.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I wanted to say. Yeah. And, it is interesting, the thrombocytopenia, patients as low as 25,000 platelet counts were allowed to be included. And that's why I think it is quite interesting. And the most interesting thing to me is the primary endpoint, and that the regulatory authorities have accepted this as a primary endpoint.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I was a bit provocative when I said this, but I do think that it's always important to look at which patient population are we looking at and what can we achieve. And there I'm absolutely with you, Haifa. I think this is a meaningful improvement if the symptoms get better. Any other thoughts? Yeah, and I think the transfusion independence rate in these patients is also relevant because it gives them more freedom away from the clinics if they don't have to be transfused. So maybe we can go on. We don't have to spend a lot of time on each of these studies. So,
Steffen,
yeah.
May I ask you whether there are explanations of why acute kidney injury after this drug and danazol as well?
Well,
because it's a severe event of this.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any mechanism that's clear for this acute kidney injury. We did a study, a retrospective analysis of our registry, and Hans Hasselblad did the same for the Danish ones. And chronic kidney injury is known to occur in MPN patients, but not acute.
Acute, yes.
Yes. Does anybody else know?
9% is not negligible.
Yeah.
1 of 10. By danazol is quite strange.
Yeah.
No? Okay.
So that could be a topic for the MPN Hub to find out.
Exactly.
Let's move on to the next slide. So this here is the BOREAS trial, assessing the efficacy and safety of naftamadlin versus best available therapy in relapsed or refractory patients that are refractory to JAK inhibitors. The drug target here is MDM2, and the idea is that if we inhibit MDM2, we can rescue TP53 expression, and that's also why only TP53 wild type patients can be included here, because this drug would also increase the expression of mutant TP53. I think this is clearly a trial of very poor risk patients who are relapsed or refractory to JAK inhibitors. And the primary endpoint is pretty standard. So spleen volume response of at least 35% at week 24. And it's a 2-to-1 randomized trial. Any thoughts on this trial?
Yes, maybe just one comment. Laura and myself, we had Clinical Hub, I think, last year on this trial. And, you know, the phase 2 was quite interesting. We didn't have alternatives, but I think this phase 3 randomized to best available therapy, excluding a JAK inhibitor. And now we have so many other alternatives. So it is, from the ethical point of view, an extremely difficult trial to include. And I communicated this fact to the company, to be honest.
Yeah.
I believe that, you know, it's difficult. We have approved alternatives. And
Yeah, I've lost 2 or 3 eligible patients because they've gone on to second or third line JAK inhibitors. This has been very troublesome for enrollment in our site as well.
yeah, and you know, it is not the best tolerable drug. It has a lot of adverse events. So I think it is good maybe in the future for accelerated and blast phases, but in a chronic phase.
Yeah, we're going to come back to that problem of the JAK inhibitors if they are not allowed in the BAT arm. I think that is a general problem, just as you indicated, and there are even more JAK inhibitors coming. Okay, so
Well, just an additional comment, maybe.
Sure.
I think that yes, we need maybe this class of drugs because there's a strong rationale showing that MDM2 is overexpressed in these diseases. However, and maybe that's a limitation for Haifa's comment about accelerated phase, because then you enrich the chances of having TP53 mutant clones in the area, and therefore to select them with this type of drug. So we have maybe to be careful with very advanced stages of the disease and be sure that we exclude TP53 mutants before starting this type of treatment, because we show that they may really be selected and increase during MDM2 inhibition.
Yeah, that's an important point, I think.
Do we know if the company is going to report the molecular data?
At least I don't. I think they're
There was an
assessing it.
overview shortly published, but they didn't publish the whole data. I think it is online. It was at the end of last year. I was a co-author actually, but they didn't publish the complete data.
Yeah, and here it says on the top it's a phase 2 and then merged into phase 3 study, which was a bit unusual also. Okay, maybe we'll go on to the next one. IMpactMF study. This is the study of imetelstat versus best available therapy for patients with MF, again, who have not responded to JAK inhibitor treatment. And again, here, BAT does not include a JAK inhibitor. So it's a similar problem here. The drug target here is telomerase. There was a phase 2 trial with 2 different doses that had an interesting finding that even though spleen response was not huge, that overall survival was unexpectedly long when compared to historic controls. And this has led to this, as I find, unique primary endpoint of overall survival. And I think eventually we really are aiming at improving overall survival in addition to symptoms and all that. What's your thought on this?
What was the follow-up of the study?
Of the phase 2 trial, I think mean follow-up must have been something like 2 years, but we can look it up. It's a JCO paper.
Yes, what was found in the phase 2 was that the observed survival in very high-risk patients, those who were triple negative, for example, or those who had really poor molecular markers, was much better than expected, although it was a single-arm study. So that's why they chose this overall survival.
Talking about the study design, you mentioned before that ethicity of the
I think
studies.
it's really a very important study, but the limitation. I'm sorry.
Exactly.
Yes,
But,
and they are.
The limitation, one of the limitations, don't have.
No, I was saying that generally the study design is shared with the authority, I mean, with EMA or FDA. So if the scientific community wants to say something about the ethicity of the control arm in these studies, I don't know whether we can embark in this way in the studies. I would like to know your thoughts about that. How can the scientific community can react when we see studies like this? We should accept them, or we can say something.
I think we can say something, but when the study was designed, in particular this one, it was many years ago when only ruxolitinib was available. So the problem occurred later with the availability of new fedratinib and in the US pacritinib.
Yeah.
But this is a new issue, and of course they should probably amend the entry criteria.
Yeah.
I
Yes,
agree.
and even they have a big issue with arm 1 because, you know, the data of the phase 2 were after ruxolitinib. There was only ruxolitinib, but now in arm 1, we could, you know, include a patient who has 3 or 4 JAK inhibitors. So, you know, the data will not become, we communicated all these thoughts and ideas to the company several times, and they really lack recruitment. It's unfortunate because I believe that imetelstat is quite promising, but I don't know. The company doesn't seem to move. I don't know. It's a pity.
I agree. And quite often we are asked for our opinions, but the talks with the regulatory authorities, FDA or EMA, have already taken place, and there's no way to change anything.
Exactly.
So I frequently suggested to come to us earlier to try to foresee something like that.
Exactly. I agree.
Well, the other thing is this speaks to Tiziano's points earlier about how we need more substantial data about how short-term endpoints translate to overall survival so that we could be recruiting smaller trials with a more short-term endpoint. But if we knew that then, if we knew that affecting the allele burden led to better overall survival, then we wouldn't have to wait for the overall survival or recruit the power needed to get to overall survival.
Yes.
I agree.
Absolutely. Absolutely agree.
Maybe also not to define overall survival in the end, we have to wait for that, but maybe to exclude drugs that don't make it to that point, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I just looked up the mean follow-up. It was 27 months in the phase 2 trial, Tiziano. So maybe can we have the next one? This is the MANIFEST-2 trial. This is the phase 3 trial looking at patients treated with pelabresib and Rux versus Rux alone with placebo in patients with MF that have not been previously treated with a JAK inhibitor. So this is the JAK naive population. And primary endpoint here is the standard spleen volume response at week 24. The drug target here is the bromodomain and extraterminal domain BET. So these are BET inhibitors. And I think at least from the first results of the phase 2 trials, this is, to my mind, interesting because the achieved SVR, 35%, is really high. I think it was 68%, and that seems to be higher than with Rux alone. And that's why I think it's going to be exciting to see whether this translates into a higher response in the combination arm versus the Rux mono arm. What do you think?
Will this be the first? Do you think this will be the first study with the true combination? I mean, I know we had like a phase where we were doing a ton of combinations, but this might be the furthest along, right?
Yes, I think the furthest one is the one coming up, the Transform 1 study with navitoclax, but this one is, I think, head-to-head. It's at the same time, launched at the same time. Yeah, so these two trials are, I think, the first ones really comparing the combination randomly, in a randomized fashion with the monotherapy of Rux. Yeah. And I think that's really necessary before we can get too excited about results of a combination phase 2 trial. We really need the randomized data comparing this to the monotherapy.
That might be something for the MPN Hub to take a look at. Is a couple of years ago, the trend was combo studies, and all of them were combo studies. Maybe just like some session that we could do that say, what's happened with all those combo studies that we were talking about in 2019, 2020, 2021, how much have actually made it through the various barriers to move to close to coming to fruition.
Yeah, I agree.
And talking again about the primary endpoints, will we be happy with this conventional endpoint, let's say, for combo therapy as first-line therapy, or will we ask for more important or more, informative results or achievements with these combinations? I don't know.
Yeah, personally, I think we will ask for more, but if it's a very high percentage of response, which is significantly better than with ruxolitinib alone, I think that might be at least convincing while we're waiting more data. What do you think?
Well, I think the other thing with endpoints, so I agree with you, Steffen, and I think we also ought to remember to emphasize patient-oriented outcomes. A lot of these are much older patients, and SVR is not as relevant unless it really comes along with transfusion independence, weight gain, life expectancy, total symptom score. I mean, when I'm talking to patients about ruxolitinib and I have an 80-year-old with, a borderline hemoglobin, one of the things I say is you may need transfusions if we start this. And that's a whole, so I think that spleen volume reduction, I understand it's objective and measurable, but I don't think we should get too far away from what's really important to the patients, especially in this older population.
And of course, we have to look at carefully the side effects, longitudinal problems in these patients. So what could be the price paid by SVR in these patients after 5 years, for instance, for these combinations? So once again, we need to change our perspective in judging the studies. It's okay, the primary endpoint occurring in 6 months or 12 months. But at the end of the day, we have to see survival, but also other toxicities.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this could be a statement that should be completed by our society. We need it.
I absolutely agree with you. And I think what really is important there as well is real-world evidence after approval that will show us after 5 years, after 10 years, how many patients are still benefiting. So
yes,
that was why I made this point about the different national registries that we have. I think these are really important in answering these questions.
Exactly, especially now that we have many drugs used, combination.
I agree so much with this in terms, and I also think that if we're making a statement about this, we also might want to invite the opinion of a patient advocate or something like that, so that there's also a importance placed on that in our discussions as well.
Yes.
Yeah,
that's very important. Yes, because this 35% SVR reduction is, of course, a strong endpoint for clinical trials. But we have to keep in mind that many patients who don't achieve such deep response feel much better with Rux alone and are very happy with 30 or 25% reduction, and that could be enough, as long as you don't increase the risk of adverse events on the one hand, or you don't also reduce the life. So we have to discuss this with patients. That's clear.
Right.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that some of the side effects aren't graded as like a grade 3, but my experience with pelabresib, for example, is weight loss and dysgeusia is pretty significant. And that may not reach a grade 3, but it also means this person's quality of life is not as good.
Yeah, very good point. That was also a point with the SMO inhibitors in the past, right?
Yeah, exactly. The same problems.
Maybe we can go on to the next one. So this is the SET Transform 1 study of navitoclax plus Rux versus Rux alone. This is a 1-to-1 randomization. The drug targets here are BCL2 and BCL-XL. So the idea is if we inhibit those, apoptosis should be increased in the cells. And again, the primary endpoint is spleen volume response. And this one, if I'm not mistaken, is fully accrued. And I think first results are expected this year. Any thoughts on this one?
I think it's almost the same comments than for the previous one. Potentially very important data, potentially new information on disease modification, maybe, but again, the improvement for patients.
The one thing I was thinking about this study is others may have seen that publication in Blood a couple months back about pure erythroid leukemia and megakaryocytic leukemia might be more sensitive to BCL-XL in blockage rather than BCL2 blockage. And that spurred me to think about MPN blast phase using navitoclax instead of venetoclax as part of the backbone. It was just in cell lines, and it was in human cell lines, and I think they had a mouse model, but it might be something that we think about in blast phase MPNs, which may have something a little bit more in common with pure erythroid leukemias and megakaryocytic leukemias, or a reason to investigate it, or to take this agent and try it in PELs as well.
Interesting.
Yes.
Tiziano. Okay.
I think we should expect a lot from this drug, I think.
Well, the other thing about is this drug, is it already moving into ET or not? Because of its effect on the platelets.
Yeah, I have.
There's an ongoing study that enrolls some ET patients called Envelope. So, but it's a small trial with small numbers of patients, but it will give some information on the efficacy in ET patients, yes.
Okay. Okay, we have 2 more to go. Maybe we can go to the next one. There, I must say, I don't know much about this particular trial. Maybe someone can add something. So the LIMBER trial is looking at the efficacy and safety of parsaclisib and Rux versus Rux alone. So there's another one of these combination trials. The drug target here is PI3K delta, and spleen volume at 24, week 24 is the primary endpoint. Does anybody know more about the recruitment here? Or
yes, I might say something. There are 2 of these trials. I don't know, they have the same heading. One is for first line and the other one is for the suboptimal response. And I don't know which one is this, but maybe we can make it short because these are 2 LIMBER trials. The tolerability, it is randomized. I never know whether the patients, but they can be unblinded after 6 months if they are in one of these LIMBER trials of suboptimal response. I can say with all our knowledge about, the PI3K delta inhibitors, especially in CLL, I think here it seems to work well. For naive patients, we don't know what it brings. But, you know, for the suboptimal, the recruitment has been stopped because interim analysis has shown that the combination is not superior to JAK inhibitor plus placebo. So it is already a failure. And we had to, you know, communicate this with our patients, and we have taken them off the trial. So for the suboptimal response, it doesn't bring anything.
I think this one is the de novo trial here of not pre-treated patients.
I think maybe these numbers, you know, they're confusing always.
Okay, so let's move on to the last one. The luspatercept or independence study is looking at patients who with MF who are treated with a JAK inhibitor, but who still require red blood cell transfusions and are then randomized in a 2-to-1 fashion to receive additional luspatercept versus placebo in addition to the JAK inhibitor. And here the primary endpoint is RBC transfusion independence for a 3-month period. And the drug targets are TGF-beta ligands. The idea is that TGF-beta suppresses erythropoiesis. So if we capture these TGF-beta ligands, erythropoiesis can be stimulated. That's the hypothesis. Any thoughts on this?
I think it is quite interesting because it is an unmet need in those transfusion-dependent patients. But, you know, the previous transfusion is an artificial limit between 8 and 12. So if you have a patient having 13 transfusions in the last 3 months, these patients are all excluded. And, you know, again, I have big issues with these artificial, because this is not real world. And when these drugs get approved, then it is best to treat every 120 years old patient with 1,000 transfusions. And always these trials do not reflect really reality. And this is really something that really annoys me in this trial. Otherwise, I think it's an interesting combination.
Yeah, I must say, I totally agree with you. The exclusion criteria are not listed here, but they're really a big problem there. We had several patients that I thought were excellent candidates for this trial, and because of some exclusion criteria, they had to come off study. This was really frustrating. Okay. Well, I think that was it. Thanks a lot for the really interesting discussion.